Michael and Daniel Grady were brothers bound by blood, driven by ambition, and feared by an entire city. But when loyalty cracked, the streets of Liverpool became a battlefield where power, betrayal, and death ruled without mercy. In the heart of Liverpool's once bustling docklands, where cranes now stood rusted and the air carried the weight of lost industry, a new kind of power was rising. The city's decline in the 1990s had left entire communities without jobs, hope, or direction. Streets that once echoed with the sound of factory whistles now pulsed with a different rhythm, one of desperation, crime, and survival. From these forgotten corners emerged two brothers, Michael and Daniel Grady, whose names would soon send chills through the entire city. They weren't born into privilege or influence. They grew up in a small council flat on the outskirts of Toxteth, surrounded by violence, addiction, and poverty. Their father was an alcoholic, their mother a cleaner struggling to keep them alive. By the time Michael was 15, he was already stealing cars, and Daniel, a year younger, followed every step he took. Their first taste of real power came from small-time hustles, selling stolen electronics, robbing warehouses, and running protection rackets in rundown pubs. But Michael was clever. He saw the city's drug trade as the future. As heroin and cocaine flooded into Britain, Liverpool's docks became the perfect entry point. He understood that whoever controlled the docks controlled the city. What started as petty crime evolved into a calculated operation. Michael used his charm to gain connections with corrupt dock workers, customs officers, and even local businessmen. Daniel, meanwhile, handled the muscle, ensuring debts were paid, rivals were silenced, and loyalty was maintained through fear. Together, they formed the backbone of a new criminal dynasty. Everything changed one cold night in 1998, when an unclaimed shipment arrived at Seaforth docks. Inside were several crates marked as coffee beans, but hidden beneath were bricks of pure Colombian cocaine. The container had been misplaced in transit, its rightful owners unaware of its location. The Gradys acted fast. They paid a dock worker to reroute the shipment, unloading it before anyone else could claim it. That single haul was worth millions. It was the turning point that transformed them from small-time crooks into major players. The brothers reinvested the profits into expanding their network, recruiting former soldiers, ex-cons, and desperate teenagers from broken estates. They began distributing drugs across Liverpool and nearby towns, using a mix of intimidation and loyalty to control the streets. By the early 2000s, the Grady brothers were untouchable. They owned clubs, car dealerships, and warehouses, all serving as fronts for their drug empire. Their money flowed like water, buying silence and protection wherever it was needed. But what made them truly dangerous wasn't just their power, it was their fearlessness. They operated in plain sight, confident that no one could bring them down. Police knew who they were but could never prove anything. Witnesses vanished, evidence disappeared, and those who spoke out were found dead in alleyways or washed up near the Mersey. Liverpool had seen gangs before, but none like the Gradys. They moved with military precision, calculated and cold. Their rise was not just a story of crime, but of ambition born from hopelessness. In a city where opportunity had dried up, they created their own. One built on blood, money, and fear. As their empire grew, so did their legend. The docklands that once defined Liverpool's prosperity were now the silent witnesses to the making of its most feared criminals. And though no one knew it then, the city was standing at the edge of a storm that would soon consume everything in its path. The Grady brothers' empire grew like wildfire, spreading across Liverpool faster than anyone could have imagined. After securing control of the docks, they turned their attention to building a structure that could sustain their criminal success for years to come. Every move they made was deliberate, every risk carefully calculated. They no longer relied on street deals or small gangs. They were businessmen now, ruthless, strategic, and cold-blooded. Michael handled the operations, sitting at the top like a chess master, while Daniel commanded the soldiers on the streets. Together, they transformed the city's underworld into a disciplined and terrifying machine. Their first step was to launder their dirty money. Michael opened several legitimate businesses, car washes, pubs, construction companies, and a logistics firm that conveniently handled shipments through the docks. Each business was a disguise for their drug trafficking network, allowing millions of pounds to move through bank accounts without raising suspicion. Local accountants and lawyers were brought in, some willingly, others through intimidation to keep the books clean. The Gradys didn't just buy luxury cars or flashy houses, they bought influence. They paid off council members, police officers, and even local journalists to keep their names out of the spotlight. The brothers ruled through both fear and reward. Those who served them well lived comfortably, their loyalty bought with money and status. But those who betrayed them met brutal ends. The Gradys had a rule: disloyalty was never forgiven. Whispers spread of men disappearing after pocketing a few £1,000s or trying to start their own side deals. Their bodies were rarely found, and when they were, the message was clear: this was what happened to traitors. As their network grew, Liverpool's nightlife became one of their greatest assets. The Gradys owned several nightclubs in the city centre where drugs flowed freely under the cover of flashing lights and loud music. These clubs were more than party venues, they were control centres where deals were made, alliances were formed, and money was exchanged. Daniel made frequent appearances, his presence alone enough to silence any trouble. To the public, they appeared as successful entrepreneurs who brought excitement and money into the city. To those in the know, they were the kings of Liverpool's underworld. Their influence reached beyond Merseyside. Through connections in Manchester, Glasgow, and Amsterdam, the Gradys expanded their import routes, securing a steady flow of cocaine and heroin. They began dealing directly with foreign suppliers, cutting out middlemen and increasing their profits. The organization grew so large that it operated like a corporation, complete with lieutenants, enforcers, and transport managers. Every role was filled with precision, and mistakes were rarely tolerated. Police efforts to dismantle the operation failed repeatedly. Raids yielded nothing but low-level dealers and decoys. The Gradys stayed untouchable, shielded by layers of intermediaries who took the fall while the brothers remained in the shadows. Investigators grew frustrated as their witnesses disappeared or withdrew their statements. It was as if the Gradys were always one step ahead, anticipating every move. By the mid-2000s, the Gradys had achieved what few criminals ever could: total dominance. They controlled the drug trade, the flow of money, and the loyalty of men too scared to disobey. But beneath their success, tension was quietly building. Michael's obsession with control and Daniel's hunger for power were slowly driving them apart. Their empire stood tall and unshakable from the outside, but cracks had already begun to form deep within. For now, though, Liverpool belonged to the Gradys, and anyone who dared to stand against them quickly learned why they were called the most feared gangsters in Britain's underworld. The night the blood flowed through Liverpool's docks marked the beginning of the end for many who dared to cross the Gradys. It started as a whisper. A rival Manchester crew had intercepted one of their drug shipments. For the Gradys, this was more than theft, it was an act of war. The cargo, hidden inside containers of imported furniture, was worth nearly £2 million. When Michael heard about it, his fury was quiet but dangerous. He believed fear was the strongest currency, and anyone who challenged his empire would pay the ultimate price. Within hours, Daniel assembled a team of loyal men, all dressed in black, armed with machetes, shotguns, and iron pipes. The docks that night were cloaked in fog, and the air carried the faint hum of ships anchored in the distance. What unfolded was an event that would forever be remembered as the blood on the docks. The Gradys struck with surgical precision. The rival crew never saw it coming. The attack lasted less than 20 minutes, but by the time it was over, 7 men were dead, and the rest had fled into the night, leaving behind the stolen shipment and trails of blood. The next morning, police found burned-out vans near the waterfront, the smell of petrol still thick in the air. No one dared to speak about what had happened. The Gradys had made their point, Liverpool was theirs, and anyone who threatened that would vanish without a trace. Fear spread faster than news. The docks, once filled with the noise of cranes and chatter, grew eerily silent after dark. Workers refused to stay late, and sailors whispered stories of men being dragged into the shadows and never returning. The brothers used the massacre to reinforce their dominance. They started calling it the message, a brutal reminder that loyalty wasn't optional. Those within their organization began to fear them more than they feared the law. The Gradys had achieved what every gangster dreams of: complete obedience through terror. But behind the scenes, Michael was uneasy. The level of violence had drawn too much attention. Reporters began investigating mysterious disappearances, and police presence around the docks increased. Still, no one dared to name the brothers publicly. Everyone knew what happened to those who spoke too much. The Gradys began operating with more sophistication after the massacre. They divided their territories into zones, each run by trusty lieutenants who reported directly to Daniel. Security tightened, operations became cleaner, and communication was coded, but violence remained the foundation of their empire. When a group of small-time dealers tried to form their own network, their bodies were found hanging from a bridge near Bootle, with a simple message spray-painted nearby: "Stay in line." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. As the years passed, the docks continued to be both a lifeline and a graveyard. Money poured in, but so did blood. Every deal, every shipment carried the weight of danger. The Gradys thrived in that environment, their fearlessness feeding their reputation. Yet beneath the surface, paranoia began to creep in. The more power they gained, the more enemies they made. Even within their ranks, whispers of greed, jealousy, and revenge began to circulate. The docks that had made them powerful were slowly becoming a curse, haunted by the ghosts of their victims. What began as a message of dominance was turning into a warning of the chaos yet to come. The Gradys' empire wasn't just built on drugs and fear, it was held together by corruption that ran deep through Liverpool's institutions. The brothers understood that violence could control the streets, but money could control everything else. From the moment they began earning serious profits, Michael made it his mission to buy silence wherever it was needed. Police, council workers, politicians, and even journalists, everyone had a price, and the Gradys were willing to pay it. What began as small bribes turned into an organized system of protection that allowed their criminal network to operate untouched. Files disappeared from police archives, surveillance footage was erased, and raids were mysteriously canceled minutes before they began. It was as if an invisible hand shielded them from justice. Michael handled the corruption like a businessman. He arranged secret meetings in back rooms of restaurants, paying officers in envelopes of cash or in favors that couldn't be traced. Daniel preferred a more forceful approach: intimidation and threats. Between the two, they created an atmosphere of control that made people choose loyalty over morality. The few who refused to cooperate found their careers destroyed or their lives cut short. One detective who had been gathering evidence against them was found dead in his car at the edge of a canal. His death officially ruled a suicide. But within the force, everyone knew what had really happened. No one dared to speak of it openly. The Gradys' web stretched beyond the police. Local politicians turned a blind eye to their operations in exchange for campaign donations and community investments. They sponsored youth clubs, repaired derelict buildings, and handed out cash to struggling families. To outsiders, they looked like generous businessmen helping rebuild Liverpool. But everyone who accepted their help unknowingly became part of their network. They owned people without ever needing to threaten them. Their power seeped into every corner of the city, blurring the line between crime and authority. Michael had mastered manipulation. He knew how to make people feel indebted to him. Bankers helped launder their money, customs officers let suspicious shipments pass unchecked, and lawyers made problems disappear before they reached court. For a time, the Gradys were untouchable, not because they were invisible, but because they were everywhere. They had made themselves too valuable, too dangerous, and too connected to remove. However, behind this illusion of control, the system was starting to rot. Corruption bred complacency, and cracks began to show. A few honest officers within the police began to quietly investigate, compiling evidence that the Grady's influence reached higher than anyone dared to admit. Reports of missing funds and bribed officials started surfacing, attracting attention from national crime agencies. But every time a lead appeared, someone leaked it to the brothers. The Gradys always seemed to know who was coming for them and when. It was as if the city itself was working in their favor. Yet even for men like the Gradys, power built on corruption had its limits. The web they had spun so carefully began to tangle, and the people who once protected them started asking for more money, more favors, more loyalty. Trust was wearing thin. The brothers were still kings of the city, but their empire was beginning to depend more on fear than rest. Beneath the surface, enemies were quietly gathering, waiting for the moment when the web of corruption would finally tear apart and expose everything they had built in the dark. For years, Michael and Daniel Grady ruled Liverpool's underworld like kings, but power has a way of poisoning even the strongest bloodlines. What began as brotherhood built on loyalty slowly turned into rivalry fed by greed. Daniel had always been the more reckless of the two, charming, unpredictable, and hungry for recognition. Michael, on the other hand, was methodical and cautious, preferring to keep their empire in the shadows. As their fortune grew, so did Daniel's ambition. He began dreaming of expanding beyond the UK, of striking deals with foreign cartels, and flooding Europe with drugs under their name. Michael saw it as unnecessary risk, a move that could expose them to authorities and enemies they couldn't control. Their arguments, once whispered behind closed doors, became frequent and heated. The turning point came when Daniel secretly reached out to a powerful Spanish cartel without his brother's knowledge. He promised them a partnership that would bring in record profits, using the Grady's existing routes through Liverpool's docks as the gateway to the UK. The deal was lucrative, but it came with dangerous strings attached. The cartel demanded faster distribution and stricter control, and Daniel, eager to prove himself, agreed to terms that would later destroy him. To make matters worse, he began hiding portions of the profits from Michael, funneling money into offshore accounts under fake names. The trust that had built their empire was crumbling piece by piece. Michael sensed something was wrong. He noticed inconsistencies in their financial reports, unexplained expenses, and missing shipments. When one of his accountants quietly mentioned Daniel's secret meetings, Michael's suspicion turned into rage. He didn't confront Daniel immediately. Instead, he began quietly investigating, questioning their men and tracing the money. What he discovered confirmed his worst fear: his brother was cutting deals behind his back. Michael felt betrayed, not just as a leader, but as blood. To him, family was sacred. Betrayal within family was unforgivable. The tension between the brothers began to spill into their organization. Their men, once united under a single command, started taking sides. Daniel's followers admired his boldness, while Michael's loyalists valued his discipline. What had once been an empire of fear and order began to fracture. Meetings turned cold, and trust disappeared from every room they entered. Daniel accused Michael of being weak, too afraid to take the risks needed to grow. Michael saw Daniel as reckless, blinded by ego and greed. Their conflict became a silent war fought through whispers, secret alliances, and hidden moves. Eventually, Michael made a decision that would change everything. He ordered a purge of those he believed were loyal to Daniel, eliminating several of their most experienced enforcers. He believed it was necessary to maintain control, but his move only pushed Daniel further away. Realizing his brother would never forgive him, Daniel turned fully toward the cartel, promising them complete cooperation in exchange for protection and power. In his desperation, he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The bond that had once made the Gradys unstoppable was gone. The empire they built together now stood on unstable ground, ready to collapse under the weight of betrayal. And as both brothers plotted against each other, neither realized that enemies outside their family were already watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike and bring the Grady dynasty to its knees. The collapse of the Grady Empire began slowly, almost invisibly, like a crack forming in a foundation long thought unbreakable. After Daniel's betrayal, everything that had made the brothers powerful started to unravel. The police, who for years had been chasing ghosts, suddenly began receiving anonymous tips that led them to hidden stash houses, coded ledgers and secret bank accounts. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Someone on the inside was feeding the authorities information, and Michael knew exactly who it was. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. His own brother, the one he had protected since childhood, had traded loyalty for survival. Within months, raids swept across Liverpool and beyond. Over 20 properties were hit in a single night, millions in cash and drugs were seized, and dozens of loyal soldiers were arrested. The media exploded with headlines about the fall of Liverpool's crime kings, but the Gradys themselves were nowhere to be found. Daniel had vanished completely, leaving behind only empty houses and offshore accounts. Michael was left to face the crumbling remains of an empire that once terrified the city. His trusted allies either fled, turned informant, or were captured. The docks that had once symbolized their strength were now surrounded by police tape, flooded with investigators piecing together years of hidden crimes. Michael went underground, constantly moving between safe houses. His paranoia grew worse by the day. He stopped sleeping, stopped trusting anyone, and rarely left the shadows. The man who had once commanded hundreds of soldiers now had only a handful of loyal followers, and even they whispered doubts behind his back. He could feel the walls closing in. The cartel was hunting him for the millions Daniel had taken, and the police were closing in from the other side. Every phone call, every noise outside his window sent him into panic. His empire had vanished, and all that remained was fear. Rumors began spreading through Liverpool's underworld. Some said Michael had gone mad, convinced that Daniel was working with the police and the cartel simultaneously. Others claimed he was planning revenge, waiting for the right moment to strike back. In truth, Michael was lost. The money no longer mattered. The power was gone. What haunted him most was the betrayal. The idea that the brother he had sacrificed everything for had turned him into a target. He knew that Daniel's deal with the cartel wouldn't last forever. Once they got what they wanted, they would silence him too. As police surveillance intensified, sightings of Michael became rarer. CCTV footage showed him wandering through empty warehouses near the docks, a shadow of the man he once was. He appeared gaunt, exhausted, and broken. His enemies didn't need to kill him. He was destroying himself. The fall of the Gradys wasn't a single explosion, but a slow decay of trust, greed, and guilt. The empire that had taken years to build had collapsed in months. For the first time, Liverpool's streets were quiet, and the name Grady was spoken only in whispers. But somewhere beyond the city, Daniel remained free, his whereabouts unknown, leaving the world to wonder who had truly won, the brother who ran, or the brother who lost everything. The unraveling of the Grady Empire reached its most shocking chapter, when the truth about Daniel's disappearance came to light. For months, Liverpool had been consumed by speculation. Some believed he had fled the country, hiding in Europe with millions in cartel money. Others whispered that he had been killed, eliminated by the same criminal world he had once controlled. No one knew for certain, and that uncertainty only deepened Michael's paranoia. But behind the scenes, Daniel was not hiding. He was negotiating. He had made a secret deal with law enforcement, one that would forever change the underworld in Liverpool. Daniel's decision was calculated. He offered authorities a full confession in exchange for protection, revealing the inner workings of the Grady's empire. Every shipment, every bribe, every violent act was meticulously detailed. He named corrupt officers, politicians, and businessmen who had kept the brothers untouchable for years. He identified key lieutenants and enforcers, tracing their connections across the UK and Europe. The information was explosive, enough to bring down dozens of people who had once believed themselves untouchable. The authorities, stunned by the scale of what they were uncovering, moved quickly, planning raids and arrests that would strike at the heart of Liverpool's underworld. Michael, meanwhile, remained unaware of the full extent of Daniel's betrayal. He continued hiding, moving from one abandoned warehouse to another, thinking he was still in control. But the walls were closing in faster than he could imagine. His men were being picked off one by one, arrested, turned informant, or eliminated under mysterious circumstances. The empire he had built on fear and loyalty was collapsing under the weight of his brother's revelations. Every step he took was being monitored, every safe house tracked, and every ally questioned. The very city he had once dominated was now a trap. The final confrontation came quietly, but with undeniable finality. Police, acting on information supplied by Daniel, surrounded one of Michael's last known hideouts at a derelict warehouse along the Mersey. Inside, Michael knew the end was near. His options had vanished, the men he trusted were gone, and the cartel he had feared was no longer a distant threat. They were closing in for the money Daniel had taken. Alone, he faced the culmination of years of power, ambition, and betrayal. By the time officers breached the building, Michael was dead. A single gunshot wound to the head, the only sign of life that remained. In his hand, a note contained only 3 words: "Blood betrays blood." The fallout from Daniel's deal sent shockwaves through Liverpool. Corrupt officers were suspended or arrested. Businessmen lost their wealth and influence, and politicians faced inquiries into their connections with organized crime. The Grady's empire was dismantled completely, leaving behind a vacuum that reshaped the city's criminal landscape. But the story did not end with arrests and headlines. The legacy of fear and violence lingered, a reminder of how deeply the brothers' control had penetrated everyday life. Families who had suffered at their hands still whispered their names, and former allies carried scars, both physical and psychological, that would never heal. Even years later, the mystery of Daniel's life continued. Some believed he had vanished under a new identity, living quietly in Europe, forever shielded by the deal he struck. Others suspected that the cartel or former enemies had eventually caught up with him, silencing him as quietly as he had silenced his rivals. What remained clear was that the Grady's story was not merely about crime. It was a tale of loyalty and betrayal, power and fear, ambition and downfall. Liverpool's most feared gangsters were gone, but the echoes of their reign lingered, a haunting truth about the cost of living outside the law. Years after the fall of the Grady brothers, Liverpool was forever marked by their reign of terror. The docks, once the beating heart of the city's criminal empire, had been cleaned up, patrolled more heavily, and monitored constantly. On the surface, life seemed to have returned to normal. Children played in parks that had once been no-go zones. Businesses reopened without fear of extortion, and the streets felt safer. But beneath this veneer of normality, the city carried the scars of decades of fear and violence. The legacy of the Gradys was not just in the memories of their victims or the headlines they made, it was in the way they had transformed the very culture of Liverpool's underworld. The brothers' story became the stuff of legend. People whispered about their audacity, their intelligence, and their cruelty. New gangs emerged, trying to replicate their success, but none ever reached the same level of fear or influence. Law enforcement used the Gradys as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly organized crime could grow if left unchecked. Their empire had been dismantled, but the principles they employed, corruption, intimidation, and strategic alliances, continued to influence criminal networks across the city. Liverpool, in a way, had learned both from their rise and their fall. For ordinary citizens, the Grady's story was more than sensational headlines. It was a lesson in survival and distrust. Many who had lived in their shadow remained cautious, never fully forgetting the men who once dictated every corner of their lives. Shopkeepers who had paid protection money, dock workers who had smuggled shipments, and families who had lost sons or brothers still carried the psychological scars. Some tried to rebuild their lives quietly. Others moved away, seeking a future untangled from the shadow of fear. Yet everywhere in Liverpool the name Grady remained a symbol of what could happen when ambition is coupled with ruthlessness, and when power goes unchecked. The police and authorities continued to study the remnants of the Grady's network, uncovering hidden accounts, secret properties, and coded ledgers. Each discovery painted a more vivid picture of how extensive the brothers' influence had been, reaching far beyond the docks into businesses, politics, and social services. Daniel, whose fate remained a mystery, became a figure of speculation. Some believed he had successfully vanished under a new identity, using his deal with law enforcement to build a quiet, anonymous life somewhere in Europe. Others theorized he had eventually been eliminated by the same cartel that had once supported him, the debts of betrayal catching up in the shadows. Despite their absence, the Grady's impact could still be felt in the city's criminal landscape. New gangs operated differently, more cautiously, aware that law enforcement had learned from Liverpool's most infamous brothers. The fear they once commanded had left a void, one that shaped behavior and strategy among those who dared to follow in their footsteps. Liverpool itself seemed to remember, the streets whispering the lessons of history to those willing to listen. The story of Michael and Daniel Grady was not just about crime or violence. It was a tale of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal, of how two brothers could rise from the shadows and dominate a city. It was a story that warned that power built on fear and corruption is fragile, vulnerable. Betrayal from within, and exposure from without. The brothers were gone, their empire destroyed, but the truth of their reign lingered, a dark imprint on Liverpool that would not easily fade. Their legacy remained, a haunting reminder that the line between survival and destruction is often only a heartbeat away.